All right, we're in objective 2 of our Power Focus Area 3 on ecosystems, so we'll jump right into that. And we're going to talk first about balance in communities. We know all ecosystems are constantly changing. The temperature even changes throughout the day, the seasons, that sort of thing, but they all are trying to maintain homeostasis. If you remember that word from biology, it's basically a nice balance. A good example is your body temperature. Unless you have a fever, your body temperature is always 98.6 degrees. And your body works hard to maintain that. You have to use energy from your food to do that. Well, your ecosystem wants to maintain a homeostasis of the number of organisms present, things like that. The environmental factors can really affect an organism's ability to survive, and that's what we're going to focus on right now. And a definition we definitely need to understand is this thing called a limiting factor. It's a living or non-living, biotic or abiotic factor that restricts how many organisms can live in an area. A common example would be like temperature. If the temperature is too hot, only certain animals can live in an area. If the temperature is too cold, only certain animals or plants can live in an area. So it's restricting or controlling how many organisms that can live in a certain place based on what animals and plants are adapted to those certain factors, whether it's the type of soil, the sunlight, the temperature, the amount of waterfall, those kinds of things. So there's this thing called the ranges of tolerance. Tolerance, you probably know, is an English word, not a science word, and it means pretty much the same thing. It's the ability to withstand changes. And in our case, the changes in biotic and abiotic factors in the environment, so the living and non-living things in the environment. Animals that live around here in Ohio, they have to be able to survive changes from 90-degree days in the summer to maybe 0 degrees and snowy days in the winter. If you can't survive that, you better find a way to leave, or you won't live and you won't survive in those areas. So there's a range of tolerance that gives an upper and lower limit that kind of defines, look, this is the highest extreme of, let's say, a temperature that this organism can survive in, and this is the lowest extreme. Anything above or below the range of tolerance, you won't find any of that type of species living there because it's too harsh of conditions for them. Obviously, some species can tolerate different conditions, so they all have different ranges of tolerance. And we'll show you a graph that talks about that. A good example is catfish. They can live in warm water with low amounts of dissolved oxygen, but trout cannot. So the range of tolerance for temperature of the water for catfish would be higher than it would be for trout. And the range of tolerance for the amount of oxygen catfish can survive would be in a lower amount than trout. They both have their own range of tolerance. It's specific to each species. And here's kind of the range of tolerance graph for any environmental factor. We're going to give names to each of the regions. In this graph, they're just color-coded, but we'll tell you kind of what the names are. And the names really kind of tell you everything you need to know about each of those areas, the brown, pink, and blue part of this graph. So the optimum range, well, optimum means best. And in this case, the highest amount of organisms are found in the blue area. So that is the optimum range. So that's the best range of, let's go with temperature, the best temperatures for a specific animal to survive in. So you're going to find most animals of a species living where that temperature range is because it's easiest for them. They survive there the best. They have the most food, that sort of thing. When we move out one to the pink parts of this graph, that's called the zone of physiological stress. And we know stress can be a bad thing. It's hard. It's difficult to deal with. And this is the zone where we're not going to see as many organisms. Notice the graph, the numbers are going down. And the reason we don't see as many is because it's harder to live in there. If we're still talking about temperature, on the high end of the zone of physiological stress to the right, the temperatures are starting to get too hot where it makes it difficult for that animal to survive. On the low end of the zone of physiological stress, the pink on the left, well, the temperatures are too low and it's difficult for the animal to survive there as well. And then in the tan areas at the far ends of both, that's called the zone of intolerance. They can't tolerate it. It's too much. You won't find any organisms there because it's too extreme of, in our example, a temperature, whether it's too high or low. You can't find animals living in those zones of intolerance. We do know communities change over time. And there's this thing called succession. And these are normal, natural changes that take place in an ecosystem. They're predictable, orderly. They happen in a certain order. They can be pretty quick in terms of years, like 10, or even pretty slow, a few hundreds of years to take place. And whether it's quick, like 10 years, or long, like hundreds of years, at the end of succession, these changes that happen in order, and I'll show you more and give you two types of examples to make this a little easier, You get a climax community. Well, like a climax of a movie or a book is the finishing, the end, the exciting part. And in succession, it's also the end. It's the stable, mature community that doesn't really undergo succession anymore. So to know what's your climax community, you find an area that's been around for a long time, look at the big plant life and animal life. So around us, we have large, mostly deciduous trees, trees that lose their leaves. That's part of the climax community around where we live. Like we said, you look at the plant life and the animals, and for us, we do have large trees. In the Midwest, out in the plains, their climax community would have grasses. They're the grasslands. They wouldn't have trees, but when it's all said and done and kind of finished, changing, they would have grasses there. The most important thing to remember about succession is the two types and the differences between them. There's primary succession. Primary kind of means first, and then there's secondary, but it's either one or the other. You're either going to have primary succession in an area or secondary. You don't really have both, and you can't have both at the same time. So primary succession is when there's an area that's never had life before and life starts to come into there. Well, that seems kind of crazy on our Earth. You're like, where has there never been life? But a common example is after a lava flow. When the lava flow hardens, it's just brand new rock that nothing has ever lived on. This is what Hawaii basically is. The big island of Hawaii, even to this day, is having lava that's constantly flowing, hardening, and there's brand new areas that never had life on it before. But areas of Hawaii that have been there long enough, life has come on that rock. And that's what succession is, life coming to an area where there isn't any, whether there never was like this, or we'll talk about the other kind in a minute. So that first species that comes in is called the pioneer species. Well, remember pioneers in American history were the first people kind of to go out west and explore. Well, the pioneer species is the first to grow in an area where there isn't life. And if we're talking about lava with primary succession, the pioneer species is always this little algae thing called lichen. And the reason they're the first is they can grow without soil, so they don't need dirt. There's no dirt on the rocks. And they can actually release like an acid that breaks down the rock slowly and forms a little layer of soil. So they can kind of create soil from the rock over time, but they don't need the soil to grow. And we just said that. So here's a picture of primary succession. If you notice on the left here, it says we start with the pioneer stages. Remember, pioneer means first. So if this is primary succession, we're starting in an area that only has bare rock. Then you can see these green and red and black areas of kind of algae. They're called lichen. They come first. And remember, they release acid that can break down the rock, crumble it up, and turn it into a little thin layer of soil. Once there's enough soil, you'll get small annual plants like grasses and some weeds and stuff. And then eventually, those start to die and make more soil, and you get the bigger things like herbs and taller grasses. Eventually, over more time, you get some shrubs, and if you're in the right area, some shade intolerant trees, so they need sun, which is good because there's nothing tall to protect them. And then eventually, in your climax community, you get shade tolerant trees, ones that can do all right in the shade because there already are some trees there. For us, what do we need to remember? Primary succession happens where no life was before, like on a rock. Lichens come first, and then you don't have to remember all these in order, but just know it is predictable. We can say we know what'll come next, and then next, and then next, and then eventually our climax community. So it is very predictable and orderly. Here's a real picture. You can see rock all around, but in this area in the middle, some lichen broke down some soil. Now we even have some small plants growing as well. So this has probably been going on for, 10, 20 years maybe to get to this point. So secondary succession is also life coming to an area where there isn't any, but the difference is they're coming to an area that used to have life that was wiped away. So things like natural disasters, floods, tornadoes, forest fires, there was life. It was wiped away, and then through secondary succession, there will be life there again. So again, commonly after natural disasters. So the big difference here is after a forest fire or a tornado or a flood, there's still soil. So the pioneer species that come in are not lichen because there's already soil. So you're already going to start with grasses, weeds, ferns, and bushes. This happens much quicker than primary succession. In fact, it's been a while now. Over 10 years ago, we had our house built. So the area we built it in, there used to be trees and stuff, but they clear everything out where your yard will be and your house will be. And when we moved in, we literally had all dirt and rocks in our front yard and our backyard. Eventually, we paid somebody to come in and plant grass and stuff, but before that, it didn't take long, a day or two, maybe 3, and weeds and little weird grasses started to grow. So secondary succession started right away. And eventually, over time, things would have grown on their own, but we wanted to speed that up and make it look nice, so we kind of changed the flow of succession on our own. And here's the difference. Secondary succession, you can see on the left, it looks at year 0. It looks like a forest fire happened, but since there's soil, it was pretty quick, and we're already getting decent-sized plants. And eventually, we go all the way to the right, but remember, there is a pattern. We know what's coming: grasses, then shrubs, then smaller trees, then bigger trees, and eventually our climax community of big forest in this area. And I've said this word a few times, but that climax community is the end result of succession. Around here, we said it's big trees, but like I hinted earlier, in the prairies, it's grasses. Out in the desert, it's cactus. So it depends where you are what the climax community is, but basically it's the big plant life that's there after succession. And grasses might not seem big to you, but that's the biggest plant life in the prairies, so that would be part of their climax community. Here's some practice questions, so you can pause these before I give the answers, because I'll just pause a second myself and then give the answers. But what happens after a forest fire? That's secondary succession. After a forest fire, there is soil. There's was soil left, so that's how we know it's going to be secondary succession. Oops, I had these with clickers before, but that's all right. We'll see how the last class did. Primary succession is quicker than secondary. That is false. Remember, with primary, we're starting on bare rock, so it takes a long time to break that down. In secondary, there's already soil present, so secondary succession is quicker. The pioneer species in primary succession is, in primary, it has to be lichen because they can grow on rock and break it down. At the end of any succession, primary or secondary, the final end result is a climax community. The end, like the end of the movie, is the climax. After a flood, what kind of succession do we have? Well, a flood might kill all the plant and animal life in an area, but there's still going to be soil, so that's secondary. After a tornado, remember, all natural disasters are going to leave some soil, so they're all going to be secondary. After a volcanic eruption, well, a volcano erupts, lava covers everything, and then hardens and turns to rock. No life has ever been on that new rock, so that's primary succession.